I'm Logan, the data newbie, and today we're going to talk about setting up a Linux VM using Hyper-V. So this all sounds cool, but what the heck is Hyper-V and why do I want to use it? So Hyper-V is a hypervisor. What that means is it's a piece of software that lets you run another operating system or another machine effectively on top of your existing machine. The most common thing out there for this is probably VMware's ESX, which you may have heard of if you're in sort of the tech industry. Another big term coming up is VDI. Basically, the idea is you have a virtual machine instead of a normal machine that you're working with. In this case, we're going to use Hyper-V because it's built into a lot of Windows installations. Effectively, if you've got Windows Vista or newer, you should have access to this. And then in Windows 8 and above, it's available in the Pro and Enterprise releases, I believe. In this case, I'm going to refer to this as Windows 10 Ultimate. Not actually the case. I had Windows 7 Ultimate, and that upgraded me to Windows 10 Pro. So the background sort of operating system we're going to be using in this case for this video is Windows 10 Pro. So hopefully that gives you a brief idea of what this is, but let's also talk about a few other things. There's another really popular hypervisor out there for sort of hobbyist purposes called Virtualbox, which is now owned by Oracle. We're going to use this over Virtualbox for two reasons. One, Hyper-V is a Type 1 hypervisor, meaning it's got direct access to underlying hardware instead of sitting basically as software on top of the operating system. This tends to have some pretty big performance benefits and, in my experience, some good stability benefits. But also, it's pretty easy to install. You don't have to download anything. It's just a Windows feature that you're going to enable, as we'll look at in this video. VirtualBox also has a lot of quirks to get running on a lot of operating systems, so in general I've had sort of hit or miss experience with it, but it's something we may touch on in a later video. We're also going to take a look at, probably take a look at anyway, containers later on, definitely a more advanced subject. With that said, I will put a link down in the description below to a recent video from Mayuko and Amy Codes, which gives a great overview of what containers are and Kubernetes to manage those. Last thing to point out here, why do we want to do this locally instead of a cloud instance, which is much easier? You sort of press a button and you've got an operating system up and running for you. The short answer is this is free. If you're doing this up on Amazon or Google Cloud or something, yes, you'll get some free credit, but that's probably not going to last you more than about a month, whereas this is good to go for as long as you've either got licensing for the underlying operating system, but we're going to use Linux, so not really an issue in that case, or until you just want to remove the image. So with that, let's hop on over to the tutorial and get you up and running. The first thing we want to do is make sure that Hyper-V is actually enabled on your machine. Again, you're going to need Windows Vista or newer, which I'm going to assume that pretty much anybody watching this on Windows has. But for the newer versions of Windows, I believe you need Pro, Enterprise, or Ultimate to have access to this. The machine I'm recording this from is using Windows 10 Ultimate, so we've got access to pretty much every feature that's out there. To ensure that you've got this, or at least have the ability to enable it, you're going to need to go into Control Panel on your machine, go into Programs and Features over here, click on that, go to Turn Windows Features On or Off over on the left-hand side, and under this list, take a look for Hyper-V. That's the service we're going to be using, and just click the little checkbox next to it to enable it. It'll take you through an install wizard, and you'll be up and running. Now that we've got Hyper-V enabled, we're going to go ahead and launch it and take a look at some of the options we have there. In this case, I'm using a system that's already been set up, so I'm going to do a review sort of after the fact. However, these are the same settings you're going to want when you're configuring it yourself. Overall, you're going to have your own machine, which will show up here. My machine's called Evo, which is why it shows up as that. But we're going to want to take a look at some of these settings that are going to be specific for my machine. So I'm going to click over on my machine here just to make sure we're focused on it, and then go over to Hyper-V settings to start. In these settings, you're able to choose where you're going to store your virtual machines for the hard drives. So this is just the default. It's under Documents. Likewise, we're putting Program Data, sort of the normal Windows path for this. Now what's cool with this, as I mentioned earlier, Hyper-V is a Type 1 hypervisor, meaning it has direct access to the underlying hardware. What this means is we can actually get direct ties into the video card that you're using as well. So if you've seen things like Linus Tech Tips with the multiple gamers, one PC type of video, this is the same sort of idea that they're using, but on a different platform. So effectively, if you wanted to have a VM, let's say, running an older version of Windows, you could do that through this and still have direct hardware access, which is pretty cool. There are a few other settings in here that we're not going to jump into. Probably the only one you really need to know is this mouse release key. So if you're doing things, you'll see that, especially in Windows VMs, and VMware does this the same way, is if you click inside the VM, you need to actually release the mouse to let it go outside of that window. So you can change this key combination to a couple different things. Effectively, this just means if you don't set this, your mouse is going to be stuck sort of inside the VM. It won't let you move it outside of the window. It sounds obnoxious, but it's actually really, really helpful. The next thing we're going to look at is the Virtual Switch Manager. And that's another setting here under your machine, so over on the right-hand side. And this is what's going to let you give network connectivity to your virtual machines. So we'll jump in there. By default, you're just going to have this default switch. You can't change anything for it. But basically, it will use your machine to do some NATing. What I've seen is this will basically result in your machine working and running, but not necessarily having internet access. If you want to have your virtual machines basically act as a network client, so the same as a different physical machine on your network, you can create a new virtual switch. In this case, I've used mine here. I've just called it Virtual Switch. And you're going to set it to external network. What this lets you do is use the actual network interface on your machine, whether that be a Wi-Fi card or an Ethernet port or something, and use that to bridge the network. So as far as my router, for example, is concerned, the virtual machines I'm going to be running are a separate physical machine on my network. So they're going to get an IP address and be treated as such. In terms of how this actually manifests itself on your machine, if you go in and take a look at your network card's properties under network adapters and control panel, you'll actually see an extra little service added to it that lets it use a Hyper-V extension for that. For our purposes, we're going to want external network for this. This is going to let us get internet access for sure for one thing, but also let us easily SSH to this if we wanted to use it outside of the context of just this one machine. The next thing we're going to do is actually create our virtual machine. So we're going to go back into Hyper-V Manager. Again, make sure your machine's in focus. Over here, we're using Evo. Over on the right-hand side, we're going to click on New. And from this drop-down, we're going to click Virtual Machine. This is going to give us a quick little wizard to go through and create our virtual machine. We won't change any defaults or anything for this. But effectively, it's going to give us a little briefing. We're going to go in, we're going to set the new name. We're going to call this CentOS Demo. And we're going to change where we're storing this. I'm just going to move it over to my E drive, for example, here, just to keep it relatively easy. We're going to, in this case, select Generation 2. This doesn't matter too much. The only reason you need to use Generation 1 is if you want to use a 32-bit virtual machine. To be honest, it's 2018. I have no idea why you'd ever want to do this, but it's there. Maybe if you're using an older version of Windows. That would probably be the main reason. Do some retro stuff. We're going to select Generation 2. Effectively, this means it's got support for some newer stuff. This will better align with what we're looking to do. Next up, we want to assign a certain amount of memory to this machine. So again, this is getting sort of physical memory access, meaning you can't over allocate past what you actually have, but I believe this version of Hyper-V has support for up to about 128 gigs of memory, which is pretty nice. Possibly more, actually, looking at this. Yeah, it looks like you're at 64-bit limits now, which is great. So in any case, I've got 16 gigs on this machine. We're just going to set up a simple Linux server we can use for some testing for this, so I'm just going to give it 8 gigs. So 8192 sounds about right. And we've got use dynamic memory for this virtual machine. So what this means is that the machine will request memory, basically it'll get something that's reserved, but it won't directly allocate it until you need it. So I'm trying to think of a decent parallel, but suffice to say it's pretty common across virtualization platforms. We can dedicate this, which means the machine will always have access to that and will actually block other processes on your server. So my Evo, for example, in this case, it will block it from having access to that memory. But in this case, we don't really care. We're not using a huge amount of memory for it, so we're just going to leave it on dynamic so we can do some multitasking a bit more easily. Next up, we're going to do configure networking. This is where we're going to select that switch we created earlier, the virtual switch that's going to let us get internet access and basically be treated as a separate network client. So virtual switch in this case. Then we're going to go on, we're going to set where we want the hard drive for this to be. So again, I'm just going to put it under my E drive. We don't need a huge amount of space for this. I'm just going to give it 30 gigs for now. Again, we're just doing sort of a quick demo. And then we're going to click next. So installation options. On the installation options page, we're going to actually point this to the source material we want to install an operating system from. We can choose to point to this later. Maybe we want to do it off a USB drive or something that we're going to sort of mount on the machine, plug in basically a bootable drive. But in this case, we have a Linux ISO we want to use, and this is going to be the latest release of CentOS. So I've got this under here in my CentOS directory. I can't remember the exact file name, so we'll just browse for it and bring it up here. So this is going to be this CentOS 7 minimal ISO. So we'll select that, and again, this can be basically anything you want. This could be a Windows ISO, could be different Linux distributions, doesn't really matter. We're going to hit next. It basically gives us a summary. It's going to tell us where the hard disk is, what operating system we're using, what we've called it, so on and so forth. Past that, click finish, and we'll move on to the next step. One thing you will need to do when using most Linux distributions in Hyper-V is go over to your virtual machine once it's created. So we've got our CentOS demo VM. Go to settings over in the bottom right hand side, so we're focused on the virtual machine, and go to security. So there's a feature in Hyper-V which is mostly towards Windows called Secure Boot. Effectively what this tries to do is prevent any sort of runtime code from accessing any of your hardware. So if you've got a malicious ISO that's loaded, you don't necessarily want to give it access to the underlying stuff on your system. In this case, this is great for Windows, which supports it, but there are no Linux distributions that support it as far as I'm aware. So we're just going to unclick Enable Secure Boot and hit Apply. Now that we've got our image ready to go, we've pointed it to our installation media, we're going to go ahead and start it up. So you can come over here and click on CentOS Demo, and then under CentOS Demo on the right-hand side, you can click on Start. What this will do is you'll see a few things flash up here. We'll see CPU usage, the assigned memory, the state telling us it's running, and the uptime for it. Now there are a few ways you could theoretically access this. If we had network connectivity for it right now, we could just jump in and go for that, but we haven't configured anything because there's no operating system. So much like other virtual machines and virtual machine hypervisors, we can actually get direct console access to this. So we're going to right click on the virtual machine and click on Connect. And this will give us a little pop-up window, and this is actually what's going to let us install everything for us. So we don't want to test the media. You can if you're worried about it. In this case, I've used it for a different install already, so I'm just going to go ahead with it. So we want to install CentOS 7, so just hit up to get to there and hit enter. So there'll be a few things that'll pop up here that may look a little weird around failing calibrations, failing to find certain things. That's just a quirk of doing this in a virtualized environment. Everything will still work regardless. So now that we're in the installer, we can pick our language. We're going to do English Canada. So you'll notice right off the bat, I've got full mouse and keyboard support. Hypervisor taking care of all of that for me, so nice and easy. So we're going to pick English Canada and click on Continue. And in here, we can set a whole bunch of stuff to start off. So we want to set our time zone. So I am this time zone, Eastern, so based around Toronto. Not where I am, but close enough. And that is definitely not the correct time, but again, this has no network access, so it doesn't know. So we're going to set this up. It's 10:11. I'll use a 24-hour clock, that's fine. And that date looks correct to me, so we will click Done. Over here, we've got keyboard. If we have a different layout, we can test things out or choose other ones, but it's got what we need for now. Likewise with language support, if we wanted to change that or add other ones, we can go in and set that up. Installation source is already taken care of. That's our ISO we picked. Software selection. So in this case, we're just going to do a minimal install. That's the ISO we've picked. But if you had the CentOS full or everything, one of the other ones that's a bit more full-featured, let's say, you could go in and actually pick your software packages here. For our purposes, we want to start out as simple as possible, and we can go in and add other things later if we want to. So the main things you're going to want to look at in here are going to be installation destination. So we're choosing automatic partitioning. We have a pretty small disk. If you know what you're doing with this, you can go in and set things up. The CentOS installer is pretty straightforward. It's just going to give you a small swap partition, boot partition, and then put everything else under root. So we're just going to leave it as is. Not something we really want to play around with just for the purposes of this demo. Again, with LVM and everything, you can always go back and change this after the fact if you really need to. Again, demo system, small disk, we're not going to play with it for now. Then we're going to go to network and hostname. So in this case, you can see we've got our network connectivity. We've got it sorted out already. We've got a hardware address for it. This is assigned from a pool that Hyper-V gives us as opposed to my actual MAC address. Speed, we've got our gigabit connection exactly as we're expecting, and down here we can set our host name. So we want to call this guy CentOS demo. We'll just leave it at that, no domain associated with it, and we're good to go. So click on done, and then we can go over to begin installation. In this case, it's going to prompt us to do a couple things. We want to set a root password in this case. I'm going to use a weak example just because, again, demo system, I'm deleting this right afterwards. I would recommend, if you're going to keep this around, use a good password. But you can see we're even warned about it here. I'm just going to click done in this case, and we'll move along. And if we wanted to create a non-root user, we can go in and do that at this time. I'll just create one called demo. So full name will be demo user. We'll just call it demo for the username. And again, we'll just put a relatively weak password for this. If we want to get into some advanced options, specifying home directories, group IDs, user IDs, we can do all that here. Again, demo system, not something we need to do, something we can look at a later time. So click on done, and then we're just going to let this run through. So I'm going to fast forward this a little bit until we get to the end. Alright, and with that, we're done with the installation. So in terms of real time, that took about probably 10 minutes to run through, but I'm also installing it to a very old hard drive, so very slow. In this case, we're done. We're going to go ahead and reboot this so that we can start using it. And there we go. We've got our CentOS Linux that we can pick up, and that's going to boot automatically for us. We don't have to press anything, just the bootloader giving us some options if we need to change things there. So this should start up. We'll see this little thing going, and we should get prompted to log in. And there we go. So we're going to log in as our root user, and there we go. We've now got a functional Linux system running CentOS 7.4. One thing to be aware of, especially if you're using the minimal version of CentOS or Fedora or anything else for this, at least out of the Red Hat versions, out of the box for minimal, you're going to have almost nothing on this machine. Your network interfaces are going to be disabled by default. You won't have any packages installed, so you won't have access to things like ifconfig. The easiest way to sort of get things going on this is going to be to make sure your network interface is enabled. To do that, we're going to go in, we're going to edit a config file. So that's going to be, we'll use VI for this. Use whatever is easier for you, but that will definitely be there by default. And that's going to be under etc sysconfig network scripts. And then we're going to go into the individual network interface. This is almost always going to be labeled as Eth0 or En0 and then a big string of numbers. The key thing we want to change here is going to be this last parameter, on boot. By default, this is set to no. All this means is that it's not going to actually try to start that network interface when we start up. We want to change this to yes so that we're going to have some network connectivity. So we'll just save that and quit out of VI, and then we'll reboot the machine. Again, we don't have ifconfig or anything here, so bouncing network interface is a bit of a pain. It's just going to be faster to reboot. So we're back up and running now, so we'll log back in. And if everything's gone correctly, we should now have internet access. So we're going to install, I believe it's network utils, which will give us access to ifconfig. So there we go. It's going to prompt us if we want to install this. Yes, we do. Yep, that's okay. This will take a second to install. And now we should have access to ifconfig. Beautiful. And we can now see our IP address as 192.168.1.231. What that is going to let us do now, we'll just move this over to the side, is, if I can get out of my window real quick, we should now be able to SSH into this machine. So 192.168.1.231. Yes, it's a new machine. We're okay with that. So you can see we've got our PuTTY window here. Go in as root, put in our password, and there we go. We're connected to it. So now we no longer need to actually use this Hyper-V manager or any of that. We'll have access to our machine just through an SSH terminal. So quick and easy. Likewise, if you're using a Windows virtual machine in this, you can now remote desktop to it if that's how you want to go about accessing it. But with that, this will set us up for some later work we're going to do, looking at different ways we can install software, setting up repositories, some basic Linux stuff as well that we're going to take a look at. Let me know if you have any questions about this in the comments section down below this video. There are definitely many other virtualization platforms out there. Virtualbox is probably one of the more popular ones. We're likely going to take a look at that in an upcoming video, especially focusing on Mac OS to host this type of stuff instead of Windows. But Virtualbox is available on basically any platform. So if you don't have Hyper-V because of whatever version of Windows you're on, you may want to take a look at Virtualbox. Thanks for watching. I hope the information that was presented here was helpful in your work or your projects. I would love to hear your feedback about this content, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below this video. If you like what you see, you can follow me on social media at twitter.com/thedatanewbie and facebook.com/thedatanewbie. And lastly, if you think this information really was valuable to your projects or your work, please take a look at my Patreon page where you can support this content creation for as little as $1 per month. You can find that at patreon.com/thedatanewbie. Thanks and good luck with your projects.